So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So I'll declare first up, I'm a maritime patrol pilot with about 4,500 hours on our maritime patrol aircraft, the P3, and I identify fairly closely with the team that was on board that aircraft. And yeah, it's important at the end of the day that we do everything possible to make sure that that we're safe and we're doing the right thing by our families, government, and everyone that's setting us forward to do what we do. So, yep, thanks for the sober sort of intro to that. So what I'll talk about today is my experience as Commander Task Unit 630.1. So just before I launch into that and embarrass myself, can I have a show of hands of folk who've deployed with the Air Task Group in a force assigned sense? A couple over this side, one over here. Could I have a handstand, thanks. Has anyone got a chance to get out and participate in any audit activities with what's going on with the Air Task Group in the logistics or the explosive ordnance sense? Okay, all right. Well, I'll do my best to paint a bit of a picture for you then in terms of how it rolls. In terms of how I drive this, is this the right device? Great. All right, so firstly, an unashamed plug for the Air Warfare Centre. And the relationship of this organisation and with explosive ordnance safety is important for Air Force and for the other services as well. We have elements within the Warfare Centre that manage the Woomera Test Range and our other primary explosive ordnance range up at Delamere up in the Northern Territory. So Woomera, we do a range of testing from both an ordnance perspective but also for countermeasures. So a whole range of trials and related activities, of which, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a significant amount of important engineering work and governance and accountabilities that run with that. But today's presentation will be about Okra. What I hope to cover here is, again, a little bit of background on what it was all about and what it continues to be about for the folk who are deployed there. I'll talk about risk stakeholders and managing risk and risk versus opportunity. And there's certainly a range of circumstances and we came across during operations where to really deliver the effect we required and improve the efficiency of what we were doing, we needed to ask some very difficult questions back through our supply chain about the munitions we were using and how we can get better effect out of them. And that puts people in an uncomfortable position, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Alrighty, so firstly, Operation Okra. Here's an example where Air Force demonstrated a fair bit of agility, as did the rest of Defence Force, really, and our supply chain and contractors, to get a combat element out to the Middle East in a very short order of time. And the only delay there you see between deploying the forces and commencing kinetic operations was really down to site licensing and moving of particular weapons and clearance with the third nations and other parts of the supply chain to actually get the stuff there. But otherwise, a fairly quick effort to get out there. It's also been sustained very effectively and efficiently for a long time now. So we're sort of approaching past the 3-year mark and a significant amount of missions and sorties being flown, and the Air Task Group itself consists of 3 flying task elements, and that's the strike task element, typically represented by one of our F-18 squadrons, either classics, alphas, or the Super Hornet models, and they're the ones currently in theatre. But also from an ordnance perspective, joined by an air refuelling tanker, KC-30, and the E-7 Wedgetail, each of which had their own parts to play, and from a governance perspective, in things like countermeasures and laser safety. Certainly high consumption rates, and as far as overall context, it's probably important to understand that what we entered into here with Operation Okra was certainly not a war of national survival, not for us. A little hairy for Daesh on the ground, certainly, but not for us. So that did provide some context to what we're doing. And I think things would probably be a little bit different if you're on the receiving end of what Daesh was favouring, and the sort of decisions you might be making might be a little bit different. But certainly from our perspective, we did have flexibility to call operational pauses, to stop and question what we're doing, to ask some hard questions and recalibrate. Now, we did that mindful of the broader context and the fact that while it was not a national war of survival for us, certainly was for the Iraqi ground troops that we were supporting on the ground. Certainly a long way from anywhere. Out the forward, our main operating base there, we had a main logistics hub just down the road, but really to get Ordnance there, even with the capabilities in the C-17, it's still a substantial hop to get our munitions all the way forward and sustain that. And a lot of fairly complex maths in between. So between the operators calculating what were going to be the typical usage rates for different sorts of weapons, different components of those weapons in terms of guidance systems, different flare packages that we might need to set up depending on which country we were flying in. So a whole lot of considerations that went into that, and that was certainly part of my staff. So I was commander of Task Unit 630.1, and within the Air Task Group, that was really responsible for the flying operations. So yeah, a command role. That said, Air Force very much operates as a team, and the respective task element commanders, some of which were squadron COs, some of which were unit executives and pulled forward to do the job, each of them bore a significant responsibility in what we're doing. We very much had to work together to understand our context and apply appropriate risk to the various domains we did so. Part of that context, I guess, was that this was not just Australia in isolation doing our thing on our bases and working entirely within our compliance regimens. We were certainly operating with a range of mutual logistics support and reliant in some respects on licensing decisions that were made by other parties that we were working with. And there were several layers of that, particularly in our context, with the primary coalition partners and then with the host nations that we're operating our bases from. So it presents quite an interesting challenge at times in terms of what folk were actually doing. High stakes activity. Look, for the air crew involved and the folk exposed out on the flight lines and through our ordnance loading areas, yeah, for sure. A lot of people are relying on them to have it all done right for them and to make it home at the end of the day, but certainly not a war of national survival. So from a risk profile perspective, absolutely working to reducing risk so far as reasonably practical, and with flexibility, as I said, to stop and have a good think about what we're doing. I have no significant ordnance training, governance or otherwise, and that's quite typical of operational commanders. Whoever's in the chair will bring what they have with them and very much reliant on the team around them to be providing the right advice. That's in the forward context, and I'll run through some of the stakeholders involved in that in a slide shortly, which is right now. So if I've got my maths right, that's a factorial symbol. I'm just sort of trying to indicate the degree to which relationships are important in terms of coming to the right risk decisions in what we're doing. In terms of commanders, really I'm responsible for safe and efficient operations on that airbase for what we're trying to do with our task unit. And I'm working very closely with my other partner nations on the base again to do that safely and make sure that our safety systems are integrated. And that's across what we typically refer to as aviation safety aspects, work health safety aspects, and then certainly within that, everything we're doing relating to ordnance as we're talking about here. The captains and crews of the aircraft operating have a significant role in what's going on with safety. So again, if there's any doubt in their minds as they're getting airborne, that's not a great thing. But professional training and a clear understanding of their weapons systems and how it works together is critically important to that. And they're certainly well trained and well versed to do that, and they need confidence in their supply chain, I guess, that the munitions that they're dealing with and the risks that they're in the business of controlling airborne are those things that are within their control. They certainly don't want to be still thinking about any particular niggles that might be with a weapon effectiveness or otherwise. and certainly not with safety. The A staff, the air staff, is effectively within the headquarters. A range of important players there. The A5, the plans guy, typically a fighter combat instructor or similar, with a deep understanding about weapons effects, and really using that operator to guide our supply demands back through the system. So that's particularly important. And if we had new opportunities or different ways we needed to use the particular suite of weapons we had, and certainly a key go-to person for me. So that's the operator guy, really, along with the squadron personnel. The other important folk in there is that I have, separate from the operator, a safety manager. That's an aviation safety manager primarily, but also a key liaison element out to the other stakeholders we're working with, and with the host nation. There's a whole bunch more relationships going on here. I have a safety manager at the ground level for work health and safety aspects, and there's certainly an interplay between aviation and workplace health and safety that we're still working through. Outside of my command, but in direct support to me, a base armaments manager, typically a warrant officer level with a deputy, and reporting to the task unit, but not directly in command. And then out with the squadrons themselves, certainly the smart gunnies, officers and airmen out looking after the equipment themselves and making sure it's all good to go. Every one of those people need to be absolutely satisfied and working at their best to make sure we're doing what we need to be doing and doing it safely. They've all got a part to play. There's a question before, I guess, up on the screen. Who can put their hand up and raise an issue? Certainly from an Air Force perspective, culturally, I think we've come a long way and we do pretty well with that these days. The only sort of barrier, I guess, is on the new folk who might be very, very new to an organisation, who haven't had time to bed in the culture. And typically from a deployment sense, that's covered back at home base before they're deployed, but it's important. Okay, so in terms of managing risk, yeah, look, to be honest, explosive ordnance safety was something that I came into my space more than I anticipated coming into the job, and I'll give you a few examples of that in a second. And the other risks that we're looking to manage are across more general aviation safety and workplace health and safety. So yes, we're handling a lot of stuff that goes bang. How do we do that safely? How do I stop people running vehicles into other vehicles when they're doing that? Whether they're our folk or other nations that might want to run into us. What can I do to make that activity as safe as possible? Heat stress was mentioned before, and certainly for Middle East operations, that's a massive factor. And if people aren't at their fittest and at their best, then that's going to introduce some risk to you that you don't really want to be doing. So regardless of which particular risk domain it happens to be. So some of the sorts of things I got involved with and I didn't really expect to be, but were good and challenging, were to do with licensing out on the aircraft ramp itself. And if you picture in your mind an expansive tarmac, an Australian detachment with our aircraft merrily lined up in amongst a sea of other aircraft, also suitably configured. And we got into a very in-depth discussion over some weeks into a month, down to the sub-metre distance about how far apart those aircraft needed to be parked and what particular angle they needed to be parked on, in case about 10 different safety systems failed and a forward-firing weapon released on the ramp. So pretty interesting stuff. Now we have a good understanding about how we apply that particular equations within our Air Force, but bear in mind that we're not always doing that on in our own sandpit. We're working with that within a coalition. So we had a bit of a trust sandwich going at one point. So we had, I guess, not opposing policy. You'd like to think that through conferences like this, we have a pretty consistent approach at the policy level. At the practical and process level, you may start to see some variances between bases, between different commands or otherwise in an international context. But at the end of the day, if it's founded in safety, then we can reasonably work with that, provided we understand what our differences are and work through those challenges. But very much in the middle of that sandwich is that human interface and that trust element. But we worked very hard across that factorial style level relationship across the coalition and across with our host nation to solve that particular challenge for us. And we did that on the ramp, and we did that sort of everywhere back through the supply chain, because again, these are pieces of Australian little logistics nodes within a broader picture, and that was important to us. So risk versus opportunity. So what were the sorts of things that had us coming back to the national support base, asking some fairly hard questions from a risk perspective? There were things like this. So I've got a red circle around there with a weapon. If your eyesight's really good, you'll see flights remaining, and you'll see bombs and lugs and a count. And the count only goes up to a fairly small number you can fit on one hand. This was a very different sort of operation to what we have done historically from an air campaigning perspective, in that we had a lot of missions that were launching with weapons that would not drop, and therefore we were getting into a situation where we were flying the weapons themselves a lot longer before we were releasing them from the aircraft. So to give you an idea in terms of numbers, I think, I was listening to DG Air talking yesterday, we're somewhere around about don't quote me on figures, but around about the 2,500 sorties conducted by our Hornet fleet at this stage. And note that each of those sorties is typically about 8 hours or longer in duration. So there's a lot of flying hours that have been done with the aircraft. Each time those aircraft are going up, they're taking anywhere between, let's say, 4 to 8 weapons apiece with them. But we've only dropped about 2,000 munitions over that equivalent number of sorties. So there's a lot of weapons hanging off aircraft, whether they're guided weapons in an air-to-air sense or they're strike weapons that are swanning around the sky and going through the stress of a afterburner takeoff, bouncing up through a hot environment. They're running from 50 degrees on the ground to minus 50 up at altitude and back again, and then they're coming back on the ground. So this was new territory for us, really. The historic experience would have been to load as many weapons on an aircraft as possible, take them forward and get rid of all of them, but we don't work like that, certainly in this campaign. The weapons we were delivering were A, extremely expensive, B, very precise in terms of delivering effect. So the decision making that went into each of those strikes, I'm very happy to say, is very, very considered and very considerable, and that gave us fantastic weapon effect with what we're doing. But it certainly meant we were flying weapons on the airframe a lot longer than we traditionally expected to. And those sort of markings are typically historic. You would have seen it's probably the same stencil from World War II, to be honest. It's been around a while, but it was certainly a question we needed to come back and understand, both from a technical engineering perspective in the aircraft and what they were doing with the bomb rack units and how they were performing, and then back through into the actual weapons themselves. And there's an important reason why the lugs is measured. I mean, that's the little bit that holds the weapon onto the bomb rack. So that's important to us as well. Similarly with the cannon rounds that were in the aircraft. Now, we didn't use a lot of cannon rounds, but it's not to say that we didn't. There was certainly a lot of occasions where the aircraft would follow up their particular bomb strike with some strafing activity, and that was reasonably successful. But again, you have a lot of rounds inside the magazine within each of the aircraft that was doing a lot of air miles and not necessarily cycling through. So the life available to that particular ordnance was equally important to us as the weapons. So a lot of discussion about, okay, well, what's the shelf life of these things? Do they have a use by date? Yes, they do. Do they have a number of flights versus number of hours type consideration. What's the mass involved with all that? And at the end of the day, these were the sorts of questions we were coming back with, and tell us about the risk. And there was lots of discussion about pressure testing and water testing and a whole range of things that went on, and very, very happy to get the result back that we can get some better flexibility out of our weapons, better effectiveness, efficiency, and certainly cost effectiveness, if nothing else, by asking some of those questions, going back and looking at the source data and doing a critical analysis on what we're actually asking for. So those are the types of questions we were dealing with. Now, these, particularly the guided weapons we use, they do have a failure rate, and by failure rate we mean failure to explode or a guidance failure, typically of the broad families. There is an acceptable failure rate with that, and each time we did that, we would quarantine the aircraft system and do a full investigation back through from the trigger effectively, right back through the bomb rack unit, now to the weapon itself, to understand whether we were seeing something different. So what there wasn't was, yep, that's within 3%, that's fine, nothing to see here, move on. That was not the case. So we released from the headquarters, I remember approaching Christmas last year after about 9 months and thinking, wonder if we're going to crack 100, and we did comfortably, but 120 incident reports back to Chief of Joint Operations and higher, explaining that yes, something's occurred, this is what we're dealing with, we've investigated thoroughly, and this is the conclusion we've come to. Now, that wasn't 110 guidance failures or UXO out of the 2,000 if you're doing the maths. There's a whole range of things that were important to us to have a look at and report. But we're across the task elements and the headquarters team, a absolute focus on safety and getting it done right. That's the validation of weapon performance. In terms of bomb prep efficiencies, I'm probably actually talking about safety and effective use of that. We deployed with and I may have had a photo of it on a previous slide or a subsequent slide, but really we deployed into effectively a bare base from our perspective, with no shelter for the weapons, so essentially stored out in the heat in the desert. We put up we had some structures erected such that the weapons themselves could be prepared out of direct sunlight if we needed to do that during the day, otherwise it was a nighttime activity. But from a back to basic safety manual handling perspective, we have a range of trolleys and devices that we use to get the weapons on the aircraft, and they're quite good. But for our weapons preparation, we didn't have a conveyor belt type system such as we found there, and that's a bit surprising. We would have been preparing bombs on the actual trailers and trolleys themselves, and there is a better way of doing that, we discovered. So we're very much attracted to opportunities like that to improve the overall safety about what we're doing. I find that interesting anyway, the photo there with the numbers on it. That's something we really needed to have a good think about, and got some good answers on. Alrighty, so this is, I guess, a bit of a run through the process that we're talking about. That's the photo I was talking about, and a bit of a conveyor belt approach to things. By doing that, and with having a larger team, and at times it was a combined US and Australian team working to commonly agreed practices and agreed and understood policy, we're able to get pretty efficient with what we're doing. And from a supervisory perspective for what was going on there, that was a hell of a lot easier to look after than if we'd done it ourselves separately to what other folk were doing. So that was great. But yeah, from the operational command perspective, and for us that was the Air Operations Centre where our senior Australian commander was there and apportioning what our aircraft would be doing. We would come up with a particular strike target or a range of close support activity that needed to be done. And we'd go through and analyse what particular weapon effects were appropriate to that, and whether the weapons we had in inventory were A, sufficient, and B, appropriate to what we needed to do. And the examples I gave is where we needed to go back and ask some hard questions about there. What I'd ask for you then is that is to appreciate that when those questions are coming back from theatre back into the national support base, we'll try to be as explicit as possible with exactly what we're after, and no is okay, provided that is the considered technical solution or response to what it is that we're doing. What we do appreciate is an understanding of what risk we're potentially taking on, and that decision support is provided to us to make those appropriate decisions. And if we're talking, I guess, about an order of magnitude change in risk, then look, that may be acceptable, and it may not be I'd ask you to consider whether it's making those change or providing those different options is in fact a safety risk, or it's actually a weapon effectiveness and therefore mission risk to us, because it might be that we can accept a higher mission risk with a bit more flexibility in terms of how we can use those weapons. There's an example given earlier today about an anti-tank round into a building as opposed to a tank. Operational decision for us in that regard, and the folk we would have calculating that risk to our personnel or the fielded forces we're doing within our operations centre organisations, and we have specialists, targeting specialists within Air Force that look at collateral damage estimation and how we would work that. So we would, that data is great, and we would use that in that sort of manner. In terms of ownership and accountability, from a moral and ethical perspective, certainly in a command role, felt that quite intensely. But at the end of the day, there is a range of accountable managers for a range of systems that we're using that we communicate with regularly to make sure we've got that right and doing it right. And communication is absolutely key to that. So hotline to the various 1 and 2 stars back in the organisation, if that's where the decisions needed to be, was where my SO1 logistics engineer and governance person would be tracking if we needed that. So, look, it works really well. It continues to work really well. We have a great working relationship with across the Allied forces that are delivering air power in a theatre at the moment. And equally with our host nation, they have been particularly gracious with their support, and where they're involved in those risk decisions, they've actually gone away and got the appropriate approvals to inform what we're doing, which has been fantastic. All right. So in conclusion, the operator versus engineer interface in this is not so much an interface as just folk in the team, particularly in theatre. We're all focused on understanding what it is that we're trying to do and making sure that we're doing it as safely as possible for the folk directly involved, the folk who might be damaged by collateral if there's a weapon lets go in on the flight line or something like that. Really important. But yeah, options and choices and decision support is certainly what's useful from the engineering and supply base with that. We'll apply whatever controls we can do in theatre to minimise risk, and if there's things we need, information we need to better do that, then we'll certainly be seeking that at all point. Lastly, not just a buzz phrase, but trust is absolutely a must there. Trust amongst the team within the air task group in our context, with the other folk that we're flying and operating with, and carrying moving lots of NEQ around the base and around us, over us and under us in aviation sense. There is a lot of trust going on, and we build that up over time through demonstrated effort and commitment to getting it right. And happily, it's gone particularly well for Australia. All right. I'm hanging around for the plenary, so you're welcome to throw anything at me right now that. Is that working? That's working. Yep, happy to take any questions now, or we can cover it in the plenary. Right on.
Hey boys, Craig Lucas from Spank. How much of the weapons came from Australia through that pipeline, or did you bring it straight from Europe, whereas we were closer to the source?
typically from Australia, but the question is, where's the weapons source that we were using, and how much of that was from the national support base through here, or how much was direct sourced in theatre. We were direct sourcing some weapons in theatre, or some components of weapons in theatre, but typically from within the coalition. So there's no contractual direct relationship back from our logistics folk. With that, it would all be running through EO branch. So even the relationship buy with the Americans, hey, you've got 200 spare weapons sitting there, you're not going to use them, how about it? Yep, there is a formal process behind that back through the branch.
Following on from that last question, were there any issues with weapon acceptance from when you were going through the buy now, pay later type option? Coalition option?
Weapon acceptance in terms of taking stores from the US, for example? All weapons that we're putting together would go through a bomb build and a bomb preparation process. So in that instance, not particularly. We'd have tracking and history on those particular weapons as they've been sitting in the depot for 6 months, 12 years, whatever the case, we'd have that data. But from an inspection and certification process in the build for that particular weapon, it would run through exactly what we're doing with all the components, as if all the components have been sourced from us. There's a more hard-nosed version of that called trust but verify. And that's equally important. At the end of the day, you do reach a point where trust is there. You establish that trust through a process and a mutual understanding about that everyone that has a role to play is doing it properly.
Yes, so just you noted a lot about the fight flight for the bombs at the last, and there are a number of reasons why they're playing out for the bombs. But I guess from a engineer perspective, E&B, it's like trying to get blood out of stone when we speak to the end users to say, what do you want this weapon to do, so we can certify to those units. And if we get tough info, this is exactly what happens. You know, with bombs at 5 times. Doesn't meet operational requirements. What's the best way we can try and put this in Australia? So yes, from a air warfare centre, knowing that the DOS is interested in safety, but I'm sure they care about performance, but they don't regulate against the law, sure.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's why I was asking before who is involved in, I guess, audit or otherwise of what we're doing, or any of the questions that we're posing there. Yeah, the answer is going to be somewhere between 5 and an infinite number. Infinite's probably wrong. In terms of time and resources to get a valued calculation on what that is that we can hang our hats on. In the absence of that data, we certainly looked across to the coalition experience, both with US Navy operating exactly the same type of aircraft effectively, of the Marine Corps, in the F-18 and a similar sort of bomb rack systems, etc. So that was a source of information for us, not necessarily data, but that data was available to us, and we can have a look at that if they had it. Similarly, with the ESAF, so there was folk we can go and talk to. Now, whether they're applying the same rigor, the same analysis to to their estimations and calculations, is a different story. So that's where, really, from a verification perspective, we want to be really clear about understanding what risks they're taking, and whether they're safety risks or their weapon effectiveness mission risks to do that. Certainly, if you look at US Navy and carrier-borne operations, from a mission risk perspective and the way they're supplied and sustained, and into the Marine Corps, it can be quite can be a slightly different calculus, I guess, to what US Air Force or any other Air Force might take with that. That's not an answer, but there are information sources, and we know at least which direction to go looking for information. If it's not there, then it may well be something that collectively between the warfare centres and the various test organisations in the US, we could get a specific task on to have a look at that. I guess just in competition with the rest of the engineering task load we might have.
Thanks, Brendan, for bringing us that perspective, and I think it is really important. It's something that we wanted to explore at this Parari, is bringing in an operational perspective, and as you've heard from a couple of the questions, there's areas that we can explore more richly, and hopefully we'll do that over the next 2 or 3 days. So thanks, Brendan.